there's a photograph that should make you uncomfortable. It's from the 1850s, taken in the heart of Paris. The streets are wide, paved with perfect precision. The buildings are magnificent, adorned with columns and intricate stonework that would take modern engineers years to replicate. Everything speaks of an advanced, thriving civilization, but there's one detail that shatters this illusion. The streets are empty, completely, utterly empty. Not a soul in sight, just ghostly architecture waiting for inhabitants who haven't arrived yet. This isn't an isolated case. From Moscow to New York, from London to Buenos Aires, the earliest photographs tell the same impossible story. Grand metropolises, fully constructed, standing vacant like stage sets awaiting their actors. And when the people finally do appear in later images, something is profoundly wrong. These aren't the descendants of the builders, they're settlers. Newcomers occupying spaces built for someone else entirely. What you're looking at isn't the natural development of human civilization. It's the aftermath of something catastrophic, something that ended one world and began another. And the evidence suggests it happened not in some distant mythological past, but shockingly recently, in the 19th century, within living memory of our great-great-grandparents. The official story we've been taught is falling apart, and once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. Welcome to the investigation of the greatest cover-up in human history, the story of how our world was reset and how we've been living in the ruins ever since. Let's start with something simple, something you can verify yourself right now, today, in almost any old city on Earth. Walk down the historic streets of St. Petersburg, Rome, Paris, or Prague. Look carefully at the buildings, not at their grand facades, but at their foundations. What you'll see should be impossible, yet it's everywhere. The first floor windows are sunk into the ground, not slightly, not by a few inches due to settling. We're talking about windows buried 3, 4, sometimes even 5 meters deep. Full-sized, beautifully decorated windows with ornate frames and careful craftsmanship now leading directly into solid earth. Doors too. Grand entrances with elaborate archways, their upper portions barely visible above the modern street level while their bases rest far below in darkness. The official explanation for this phenomenon is laughable. We're told this is the cultural layer, the natural accumulation of dirt, debris, and waste over centuries. According to historians, people were simply so dirty, so careless, that over hundreds of years the ground level rose organically by the height of an entire story or more. They compacted their trash, they never cleaned, and eventually they just built new roads on top of the old ones, burying their own buildings in the process. Think about that for a moment, really think about it. 5 meters is the height of a 1.5-story building. We're supposed to believe that our ancestors, who possessed the engineering genius to construct these magnificent structures with perfect precision, who could calculate load-bearing capacities and create architectural masterpieces, were simultaneously too stupid or too lazy to remove garbage from their streets. That they voluntarily lived in a planetary-scale pigsty, slowly burying their own cities in filth. But here's what demolishes this theory completely. When construction crews excavate these buried levels, they don't find primitive cellars or storage spaces. They find complete, fully functional first floors, with windows, with doors, with decorative mouldings and careful finishes, with everything a ground floor should have because that's exactly what they were. No architect in their right mind would design a building with beautiful, expensive windows on the basement level, knowing they'd be underground and invisible. No one would waste resources creating elaborate entrances that lead into dirt. These floors were built to be seen, to be used, to be at street level, but they're not anymore. Something buried them, something sudden, something global. This phenomenon isn't limited to a few cities or one region, it's worldwide. From Siberia to South America, from North America to Asia, the same pattern repeats. The first floors of 19th century buildings and earlier are underground. This isn't a cultural layer, it's a burial layer, and it points to an event so massive, so catastrophic, that it reshaped the surface of the entire planet. But what could bury entire cities? What force could deposit meters of earth and clay over vast territories in a short enough time that the buildings remained intact, not destroyed, but simply engulfed? The answer lies in old photographs and a theory that sounds insane until you see the evidence. The mud flood. In the coastal regions, the evidence points to something out of a nightmare. A wall of water, ice and sediment, a tsunami of biblical proportions, but not just water. A churning mass of mud, clay, debris from the ocean floor, and massive chunks of ice, sweeping inland with such force that nothing could stand against it. And yet, paradoxically, the buildings survived. That's the key detail that makes no sense if we're talking about a normal tsunami. Look at Seattle. In photographs from the late 1800s, we see something that defies explanation. The city is literally breaking free from the earth. Houses stand at the base of massive cliffs of compacted soil, nearly vertical walls of earth that rise higher than the buildings themselves. In other images, entire structures sit atop these earthen mounds, tilted at dangerous angles, as if they'd been carefully excavated from a thick layer of mud that had hardened around them. And here's where it gets truly strange. The official records call these glacial hills, not metaphorically. That's the actual term, used by the city engineer who oversaw their removal. Glacial hills. In Seattle, a city at the 47th parallel with a temperate maritime climate. Why would there be glacial formations there? The answer becomes clear when we look at how they removed this earth. They didn't dig it out with shovels. They washed it away with high-pressure water jets, the exact same technique used by gold miners in Alaska to melt permafrost. They were thawing it, because it wasn't just compacted earth, it was frozen. The evidence points to this. A massive wave of icy mud swept in from the ocean, a slurry of water, sediment, and ice that buried everything in its path, then froze solid. The cities were entombed in a kind of flash permafrost, and when it finally began to thaw decades later, the new inhabitants had to wash away millions of cubic meters of this frozen mud, dumping it all into the sea on barges. But Seattle is on the coast. What about cities inland? What about places like Kansas City sitting nearly 900 feet above sea level in the heart of the continent, thousands of miles from any ocean? No tsunami, no matter how massive, could have reached it. Yet the photographs from the 1860s show buildings there buried even deeper than in Seattle. Some structures covered up to 23 feet, with only their upper floors visible above the earth. The terrain around Kansas City in early photographs is strange. It's not flat. It's not the aftermath of liquid mud. It's undulating, wave-like, almost like sand dunes frozen in time. And there are almost no mature trees, just young saplings, as if the entire landscape had been scoured clean not long before the photograph was taken. This points to a different catastrophe entirely. Not water, but air. Massive dust storms of apocalyptic scale. Imagine the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, but magnified 1,000 times. Storms that raged for years, perhaps decades, stripping the topsoil from vast territories and depositing it elsewhere, burying cities under meters of loose, dry sediment. This would explain why the buildings survived intact. A dust storm doesn't destroy with kinetic force like a tsunami. It engulfs. It smothers. Billions of particles of sand and dust, driven by relentless wind, accumulate against walls, fill streets, pour through any opening, but don't knock structures down. They bury them, like Pompeii, preserving them in a sandy tomb. We can see this process happening today in miniature. In the Russian village of Shoina, the world's northernmost desert is slowly swallowing houses, burying them up to their roofs in sand. The windows fill with it, the streets disappear under it. It's a modern demonstration of how the element of air can bury a civilization without destroying it. So we have two different catastrophes, two different mechanisms, but the same result. Coastal cities drowned in frozen mud, inland cities smothered in dust and sand. But here's the crucial question: what could cause both? What global event could trigger ice tsunamis in some regions and apocalyptic sandstorms in others simultaneously? The answer points to something truly massive, a planetary-scale disruption. And when we examine the timeline, when we look at exactly when these photographs were taken, when the excavation and regrading of cities happened, a pattern emerges. Everything points to the early to mid-19th century. Everything points to a reset. But physical evidence is only half the story. The other half is written in something far harder to fake. It's written in the faces and lives of millions who appeared seemingly from nowhere to fill these empty cities. In the mid-19th century, a phenomenon swept across the globe that historians have never adequately explained. The sudden, massive, inexplicable appearance of orphans. Not just a few, not a local tragedy. We're talking about millions of children all over the world with no parents, no families, no history. The scale is staggering. In Russia alone, enormous. Foundling homes were constructed, designed to house tens of thousands of children at once. In London and Paris, orphanages overflowed. In the United States, a program called the Orphan Trains operated for decades, transporting hundreds of thousands of children from the overcrowded East Coast to the frontier West, where they were distributed to farmers and families as free labour. According to partial records, more than 200,000 children were relocated through this single program. But that's just what was documented in America. Similar operations ran in Britain, shipping children to Australia and Canada. In France, in Germany, in Russia, everywhere, the same massive infrastructure appeared simultaneously to handle this unprecedented flood of parentless children. Where did they come from? The official explanations don't hold water. Wars? Which wars were so catastrophic and so geographically widespread that they left millions of children orphaned simultaneously across every continent? Epidemics? What disease killed parents but spared their children in such vast numbers? The Industrial Revolution? Factory deaths don't create orphans by the millions in agricultural societies. No conventional explanation fits the scale. But one unconventional explanation fits perfectly. These weren't orphans in the traditional sense. They were the first generation, the settlers, the population that appeared to fill the empty cities after whatever catastrophe had depopulated them. Look at the photographs from this era. Not the buildings, but the people. Study their faces. There's something off about them. They don't look like generational city dwellers. They look displaced, uncomfortable, like people who've just moved into a space not designed for them, because that's exactly what they were. And here's the detail that should chill you. For the vast majority of people on Earth, genealogical records don't extend past the mid-19th century. Ask yourself right now, can you name your great-great-grandfather? Do you know where he lived, where he's buried? For 90% of people, the family tree is severed somewhere around the 1850s or 1860s. Beyond that point lies fog, silence, as if history itself was reset. This isn't natural. Human genealogy doesn't work this way. In societies that kept records, in cultures that valued ancestry, this kind of mass amnesia doesn't happen organically. It happens when there's a break, a discontinuity, a point where one population ends and another begins. The theory becomes unavoidable. These millions of children weren't orphans. They were manufactured, raised in institutions, given simple surnames, Smith, Johnson, Ivanov, Petrov, educated with a simple, linear, acceptable history, and sent out to populate the ruins of a civilization they were told was their own achievement. We are a civilization of orphans. Our roots don't go back thousands of years. They go back less than 200. And everything before that? It belongs to someone else. But if this mass repopulation really happened, if our entire modern civilization is built on this lie, then the evidence of the previous world would need to be systematically destroyed or hidden. And that's exactly what we find. Fire. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, a suspicious wave of great fires swept the world. The Great Fire of Moscow in 1812, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the Great Boston Fire of 1872, San Francisco burned in 1906, and these are just the famous ones. Hundreds of cities experienced devastating fires during this period, fires that the official records blame on accidents. A fallen candle, a cow kicking over a lamp, carelessness. But look at the photographs of the aftermath. These weren't wooden villages burning. These were stone cities, granite buildings, marble columns, and yet they burned so hot so completely that stone crumbled to powder. Granite blocks that should be fireproof show signs of exposure to temperatures, far beyond what a normal urban fire could achieve. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate cleanup. And notice what burned with particular thoroughness. Archives, libraries, city halls, record offices, patent offices. Everywhere that documentation of the previous civilization might have survived, fire found it. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example, but the pattern continued into the modern era. Every time too much inconvenient evidence accumulated in one place, flames mysteriously consumed it. We were left with carefully curated textbooks that tell us illiterate peasants with hammers and chisels built architectural masterpieces we cannot replicate today, even with lasers and computer modelling. But the most cynical part of the cover-up wasn't the destruction. It was the spectacle, the world's fairs. From the 1850s through the early 1900s, massive world's fairs were held in cities across the globe. Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, Brussels, Barcelona, Buffalo, and the official story about these events is perhaps the most insulting lie of all. We're told that for each fair, entire cities of neoclassical buildings were constructed in just 1 or 2 years from temporary materials. Plaster, straw, and horsehair mixed into a substance called staff. According to the records, armies of workers erected hundreds of buildings, some larger than St. Peter's Basilica, complete with domes, colonnades, statuary, artificial canals, electric illumination, and complex infrastructure. Then, after the fair ended, usually within a few months, all of this was demolished, torn down, destroyed, erased. Look at the photographs. These aren't temporary pavilions. These are monumental structures of staggering complexity and beauty. Buildings that would take modern construction crews years to complete, even with steel, concrete, and heavy machinery. The idea that they were built from plaster in months, then casually demolished, is absurd. The truth is obvious once you see it. These weren't built for the fairs. They were found. They were excavated. They were districts of the previous civilization that had survived, that hadn't been completely buried or destroyed. The fair organizers cleaned them, restored them, connected them to the electrical grid, which may have been part of their original infrastructure, and displayed them to an amazed public. But they couldn't let them stand, because they were too perfect, too advanced. They showed a level of technology and aesthetic achievement that couldn't be explained by the steam engine and manual labour. They were living proof of a lost golden age. So after the exhibitions closed, these complexes were systematically demolished, blown up. The rubble was dumped into rivers and harbours to create new embankments. The evidence was destroyed. This was the final stage of the cleanup, the erasure of the most obvious, most beautiful, most perfect physical evidence of the previous civilization. They left us with just enough ruins, just enough fragments that we'd marvel at our primitive ancestors while never quite grasping what had really been lost. But here's what they couldn't erase completely: the buildings that were too big to demolish, the ones that had been repurposed, that were serving functions in the new society, the grand palaces, the cathedrals, the structures that were so massive, so integral to the cities, that they had to be kept and their history rewritten. And it's in these buildings that the most damning evidence remains. Evidence carved in stone and built into the very architecture itself. Stand in front of any major cathedral in Europe: Notre Dame, Cologne Cathedral, St. Peter's Basilica. These aren't just large buildings, they're impossibly large. The doors are gigantic, 4 or 5 meters high. The door handles are positioned at face level or higher for an average person, requiring you to reach up significantly just to grasp them. The ceilings soar to heights that serve no practical purpose for human habitation. In northern climates, such spaces are nearly impossible to heat. The small decorative fireplaces installed later are completely inadequate. Modern thermal imaging shows that even with every fireplace blazing, the heat rises immediately to the ceiling, leaving the lower levels freezing. Yet we're told people built these spaces deliberately, knowing they'd be unusable for half the year. The windows begin far above human eye level and extend upward into the unreachable heights. The staircases have steps that are awkwardly tall and wide, making them uncomfortable and even dangerous to climb. Every proportion is wrong, not slightly off, but fundamentally, obviously wrong for human beings of our size. There's only one explanation that makes sense. These buildings weren't built for us. They were built for beings of a much greater stature. And once you see this, once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. Every palace, every castle, every cathedral in the world screams the same truth. We are Lilliputians living in the land of Gullivers. The evidence for giants isn't hidden in mythology. It's on display in every museum, hiding in plain sight labelled as something else. Those ceremonial swords that are impossibly long and heavy for a normal human to wield effectively. The papal rings that a coin can pass through easily, far too large for any human finger. The punt guns that show evidence of being shoulder-fired weapons, with stocks that have been filed down and fitted, despite being sized for someone 8 or 9 feet tall. The armour is perhaps most telling, not the decorative pieces, but the functional suits. When you stand next to them, when you really look at them, they're enormous. These weren't made for tall humans. They were made for a different species entirely, a species that lived here, that built these cities, and that disappeared. But we're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about the 19th century, because that's when they were still here. That's when the transition happened. That's when the old world ended and the new one began. Photographs from the late 1800s sometimes capture them. Unusually tall individuals, always with canes or crutches, struggling to support their own weight. Because by then, the world had changed. The conditions that allowed them to exist were gone. According to the theory preserved in fragments of ancient knowledge, the Earth's atmosphere was once very different. A dense vapor canopy existed high in the sky, creating massive atmospheric pressure, a uniform mild climate from pole to pole, and significantly lower gravity at the surface. In these conditions, giants could thrive. Their physiology was perfectly adapted to this environment. But something destroyed that canopy. The evidence points to a war, a conflict using weapons of such power that they disrupted the entire planetary system. Explosions threw massive amounts of dust and debris into the stratosphere. When these particles reached the vapor layer, they acted as condensation nuclei. The entire canopy collapsed in a matter of days or weeks, pouring down as the biblical flood. In the polar regions, this water fell as ice and snow, instantly creating the glaciers we see today. Elsewhere, it fell as torrential rain mixed with mud and debris. And when it finally stopped, when the skies cleared, everything had changed. The atmospheric pressure dropped by nearly half. The climate became harsh, with scorching deserts and frozen poles instead of the uniform paradise that had existed before. For the giants, this was a death sentence. Their bodies couldn't cope with the new gravity. Their cardiovascular systems failed. They couldn't stand without support. Within a generation or two, they were gone. The last few survivors appear in photographs from the early 1900s, then vanish completely from the record. And for us, we were affected too, though not as drastically. Human physiology was designed for the old world as well. That's why our internal organs have a functional lifespan of 500 to 600 years, far longer than we ever live. That's why our bodies are so dependent on salt, desperately trying to maintain internal pressure in an environment with too little external pressure. We're running on emergency mode, burning through our biological resources in decades when we should be living for centuries. We survived the change, but we were diminished by it, and in the chaos that followed, in the depopulated ruins of the giant civilization, we were resettled, raised in institutions, given a new history, told that all of this, everything around us, was built by our primitive ancestors with hand tools and animal labor. It's the perfect crime. Steal an entire civilization. Destroy the evidence. Replace the population. Rewrite the history. And convince the new inhabitants that they should be proud of what their ancestors accomplished, when in reality, they're squatting in someone else's ruins. But why? Who benefits from this massive deception? The answer is as old as civilization itself: control. Imagine if people knew the truth. Imagine if everyone understood that free energy once existed, that clean wireless power was available to all, that massive structures could be built with technologies we've lost, that human beings once lived for centuries instead of decades. Imagine if people knew that all of this was taken from us deliberately. You can't control people who have that knowledge. You can't sell them electricity when they know it should be free. You can't keep them dependent when they understand their own potential. You can't maintain a system of scarcity and control over a population that remembers abundance. So the truth had to be buried. The previous civilization had to be erased. And we had to be convinced that we're living in the best possible world, at the peak of human achievement, slowly climbing up from primitive origins, when in reality we're living in the dark age, following a golden age we're not supposed to remember. The evidence is everywhere, once you know what to look for. The buried first floors, the empty cities in early photographs, the millions of orphans, the suspicious fires, the demolished World's Fairs, the giants in the museums, the impossible architecture, the traces of free energy systems, the sudden technological regression. All of it points to the same conclusion. In the 19th century, sometime between 1800 and 1850, the world was reset. A catastrophe destroyed the previous civilization. The survivors, or perhaps a new population entirely, were brought in to inhabit the ruins. History was rewritten. Technology was controlled. And humanity began again, this time under the watchful eye of those who made sure we would never rise to those heights again. This is not ancient history. This is recent. This happened to our great-great-grandparents, the people who knew the truth, who remembered the old world. They're only a few generations removed from us. And that's exactly why the cover-up had to be so complete. Because unlike events from thousands of years ago, this was recent enough that evidence remains. Recent enough that we can still uncover it. Look at your own family tree. How far back can you trace it with certainty? For most people, it ends around 1850. Before that, there's nothing. No records, no graves, no connections. As if your family line simply began at that point, springing into existence fully formed. That's not natural. That's not how human genealogy works. It's what happens when a population is replaced. When orphans are given new surnames and told they're the continuation of a line that never existed. We are those orphans, grown up, generations removed, living in the ruins and believing them to be our birthright. The implications of this are staggering. Everything we think we know about progress, about the arc of human history, about our place in the world, it's based on a lie. We're not the pinnacle of civilization slowly advancing from cave-dwelling primitives. We're the degraded remnants of something far greater, living in the shadow of achievements we can barely comprehend, let alone recreate. The stone giants that surround us in every old city, the cathedrals and palaces and bridges, they're not ours. We didn't build them, we inherited them, and we've been taught to be grateful for the privilege of living in them, maintaining them, marveling at how clever our ancestors were with their primitive tools. But the stones know the truth. The granite blocks weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The polygonal masonry that no modern technique can replicate. The massive foundations that go down far deeper than any building of that supposed era would need. The erosion patterns that indicate ages far greater than the official chronology allows. These stones cannot be made to lie. They stand as permanent witnesses to a truth that cannot be erased, no matter how thoroughly the written records are destroyed, no matter how many fires consume the archives. And now you know. Now you've seen the evidence, the empty cities, the buried floors, the millions of orphans, the impossible architecture, the giants who lived among us until shockingly recently, the catastrophe that reset everything. You can choose to look away. You can choose to accept the comfortable narrative you were taught in school. Or you can choose to see the world as it really is. A stage set from a previous play, repurposed for a new performance, with us as the unwitting actors reciting lines written by someone else. The 19th century wasn't the beginning of the modern world. It was the aftermath of the old world's end. And we're living in that aftermath still, generation after generation, moving further from the truth with each passing year. Unless we choose to remember, unless we choose to look at the evidence with clear eyes, unless we choose to ask the questions that no one wants us to ask. Who built these cities? Where did they go? Why were we told we built them? What technology did they possess? Why was it taken from us? Who made that choice? And what else are we not being told? These aren't idle questions. They're the most important questions we can ask. Because the answers don't just change our understanding of the past. They change our understanding of who we are, what we're capable of, and what was stolen from us. The reset happened. The evidence is irrefutable. The only question that remains is what we're going to do with that knowledge. Will we continue to live in the lie? Or will we reclaim the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how much it changes everything? The stones are waiting. They've been waiting for almost 200 years. Waiting for someone to listen. Waiting for someone to remember. Waiting for the moment when enough people see the truth that it can no longer be hidden. That moment is now. The awakening has begun. And once you see it, you can never go back to sleep. The 19th century was the year the world restarted, and we've been living in the consequences ever since. But knowledge is power, and now you have the knowledge. The question is, what will you do with it?